Our next speaker is Itrath Syed. Itrath is a PhD candidate at the School of Communication at SFU, where her research involves an analysis of the discursive regimes that govern Muslim subjectivities in Canada post 9/11. She also teaches women's studies at Langara College and Asian studies at Kwantlen University. Itrath has a history of activism against war and occupation and against the racial profiling of the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in Canada. Please join me in welcoming Itrath.
So firstly, I want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and that my family and I have been settlers here since 1973, and I want to acknowledge their sovereignty of this land. To begin with, when we're talking about Islamophobia, I think it's useful to begin with the definition. So for me, I define Islamophobia, and the working definition that I use, and I think many use, is that it is a form of racism. And it is the process by which Muslim people, or people assumed to be Muslim, are racialized. And so it's like all kinds of racism. It's not about the body, because the Muslim community itself is ethnically, linguistically, culturally very diverse. It's not like any other kind of racism. It's a social construction, and it's about the Muslim people being sort of racialized, and upon whom a set of traits and tropes and negative ideas are being imposed. So in that regard, I think Muslim and Islam become code words for a whole set of ideas and fears. And of course, this has a really long history. Very long, but I think there's historically specific and socially specific manifestations of it. And I think Islamophobia looks different in Quebec than it does in Ontario or BC. Islamophobia looks different in England than it does in the United States. Islamophobia looks different in different regions and throughout history. And I think it's important, while we understand sort of the long history of this, to also understand the very specific ways that it functions. So what I am interested in looking at is how Islamophobia is used as a tool during specific moments of media crises. So, or what I would say are moral panics. So I look at moral panics as a particular moment, a temporally contained moment in which there is some issue that everybody's obsessed about and is kind of constructed of such a great concern that sort of stands in for a moment of national crisis or a civilizational crisis. And you all know these moments. They're the various different moments of crises, mostly around Muslim women's bodies, but generally around some kind of way in which Muslim bodies, visible Muslim bodies, are troubling our public sphere, and around which sort of a whole set of other questions become anchored. So these kinds of panics that are in the media, whether it's the citizenship niqab thing, or the Charter of Quebec Values, or whatever the particular issue of the day is, or the Ground Zero Mosque issue, or whatever the particular crisis, it's temporally contained and cyclical, in that in all sort of self-understood Western states, that they sort of arise in a sort of cyclical pattern. And I'm interested to see how they work and why they work and what is actually happening in them. And to really think about why they are deployed in the way that they are and what function they accomplish. So I would say that in many of these instances, these kinds of moments of media crisis around Muslim bodies is really about how a nation is defined. And they're used as a way to define a boundary between those who belong, who have a right to belong, who are seen to belong, who are on the inside, and the rest of us. So it defines the here from the there. They're used to demarcate these kinds of boundaries, and often the boundary lines run straight through Muslim women's bodies. So we've seen this in multiple different instances. We've seen this if I just look at the very recent history, it often sort of is deployed around and in an election cycle. So we've seen this in the last Quebec national, what they would call a national election, but the Quebec election around the Charter of Quebec Values. We saw this in the federal election in the fall, and we're seeing this right now. in kind of, I mean, the version we're seeing right now in the States is it's on steroids, but it is basically taking the same familiar tropes, the same kinds of moments of crises, and reactivating. In the last federal election, we saw how Harper did the same thing, how he looked to construct Muslims as the most critical fear facing Canada in order to get support. And I think this is the key thing, like, what was the purpose of that? And the reason for that is not only to align himself with transnational global Islamophobic forces and right-wing governments, but also to gain momentum and legitimation for his larger project of securitization and the whole-scale removal and attack on civil liberties in Canada. So, and what we're seeing in the States right now, we also need to think that it's not just Trump making stupid comments and racist and fascist comments. It's actually about the result. There is a body toll to this, and we've seen a rapid increase, a huge spike within this last several months of violence against Muslim bodies, Muslims in all over the States. There's just yesterday, or this morning, actually, yet another anti-Muslim protest in front of mosques. So it's become routine to have open carry protests, which means that always white men with guns and in military, like pseudo-military garb, like, so these are just, people playing at killing, walking around, sort of walking back up and down the street in front of a mosque with rifles, through which Muslim community has to go to attend mosque or to go to school or whatever. This is legal, by the way, and is happening with greater frequency. There's violent attacks on Muslims all over the U.S. in this last few months and historically, but there's a rise. And it's not just upon Muslims. It's about anyone who's assumed to be Muslims, because it's not about Islam per se. It's about the racialized construction of what it means to be Muslim, what the possibilities are of being Muslim in the States. But it's not just in the States, so it's also in Canada. So just for fun, I thought I would go to the NCCM website today and pull off some incidents that have happened in Canada. So these are some incidents that have happened in the last 3 months in Canada. So the NCCM, you can go to their website, it's nccm.ca. NCCM stands for the National Council of Canadian Muslims. And if you go to their website, they have a live interactive map that is tracking Islamophobic incidences across the country. So you can just go, you click on the thing, and you can read about the incident. So going backwards in time, so March 17th, in Nepean, Ontario, an executive member and board member of an organization received a telephone death threat, and a voicemail was left for them, asking them to. They were called something along the lines of effing Palestinian terrorists and told that they would soon be going to heaven. In Quebec, on February 29th, a young woman in hijab was exiting a bus at a station in the afternoon when a white male began yelling at her and suddenly slammed his body into her, knocking her to the ground. In Alberta, on February 20th, vandals spray-painted hateful messages on the walls of a southeast Calgary school. The message read, "Syrians are animals and real Canadians hate Syrians," as well as "Burn all mosques, Syrians go home and take Trudeau." While Syrians feast in hotels, Canadians starve on the streets, kill the traitor Trudeau. So that was in Calgary. On February 12th, in Quebec, a father with his children, including a teenage daughter who wears a headscarf, were yelled at and threatened at a McDonald's restaurant. On February 8th, on Toronto, an anti-Marxist newspaper is distributed by Canada Post to thousands of homes in the GTA, in the Greater Toronto Area, with offensive and stereotypical images of Muslim caricatures, as well as mentions of political leaders. Here in Richmond, on February 4th, the leader of a community institution received a short phone call from an unknown number. It's described as the caller was male and sounded very agitated and angry, and said he responded by saying, "To blow people up, you are Muslims. You blow people up. You have a nice day, bitch." The caller ended, so that was the call. It was in Ontario in January 27th. An unknown caller left a hateful anti-Muslim voicemail at the NCCM offices. I won't read the call, it's pretty horrible. And then on January 25th in Ottawa, the City for All Women's Initiative Facebook page received dozens of anti-Islamic and xenophobic messages following their post that was detailing Ottawa Hijab Day. And since then, 400 people have commented and left hateful messages. On January 11th in Calgary, a South Asian man was victim to racial slurs by a couple while shopping at Walmart. And they called, I'm not going to read what they said. In January 9th in Vancouver, a crowd of refugees attending a welcome event at the Muslim Association of Canada Centre, just very close to where we are right now, were pepper sprayed by a man on a bicycle. On January 1st in Ontario, a Muslim Facebook group, the World Coalition Against Islam, publicly threatened a Muslim woman. The group disclosed personal information about the specific woman and incited its members to seek her out in person and attack her. So I think I think it's important to understand that when we're talking about all of these moments of media panic where the Muslim community specifically and visible Muslims are targeted and constructed as hated and feared, and all of this sort of conversation is happening, that it's not just language, it's not just discourse, but there's actually a body count, and that it actually affects the material reality of what it means to be a visible Muslim or someone who could be read, whose body could be read as Muslim, and walking down the street. It changes the way you live your life. So this is a thing that has a sort of a deeply personal effect on how people in this country live their life. But I think the role of the media is really critical because when these media moments happen, they operate as a sort of shorthand. So the media doesn't necessarily have to doesn't say everything. It doesn't the images, particularly images of women in face veils, women in headscarves, bearded men, these sort of images become sort of signifiers, master signifiers, and they become coded. And when you see this image, you don't have to read all of the story. It already triggers a set of ideas, and that has to be unpacked and deconstructed. And what's also important to think about that when we have these conversations they're over and about Muslim women, Muslim bodies, mostly Muslim women's bodies, because these incidents are not only racialized but very, very gendered. That when these are happening, what's actually happening is that there are a lot of people a lot of white people in power talking about Muslims negatively, and a lot of white people in power talking about Muslims positively. What is missing from this conversation is actually the input of the Muslim community. And in fact, the conversation itself, so whether you're on the left or the right of that conversation, still erases the actual subjectivity, the actual humanity of the Muslim community. They're actually stripped out of that conversation because it's almost like not about us, right? It's about it's about two sets of people who in themselves understand themselves to have the right of belonging and the right of determining who belongs, discuss the issue with each other. And so part of the problem with the way that this spins out is that Muslims are not able to be heard in this discourse, and they're not able to actually intervene in any kind of way. And an example of this is that whenever I do even a 2-minute radio thing or any kind of media thing, there's always going to be some person who's going to call in or stand up and say, but why don't Muslims condemn violence? I think I might have heard that question 7 million times in my adult political life. So the question is, obviously, every single Muslim who ever is near a mic has condemned political violence, even though the question itself is deeply problematic. Because I don't think any white person in this city has been asked to condemn the violence of any other white person on the planet. That is never the expectation. But there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of demand that Muslims, individuals and community organizations issue statements. And everybody does. In fact, before BBC can cover an event, my inbox is full of condemnations. And we need to think about what that's about. We need to think about why that question is asked. But more importantly, we need to think about why the answer is never heard. Why is it so impossible to hear the condemnations that are so constantly demanded? And I would argue that it's because it doesn't matter what we say. We're not actually heard. Nothing we say can be heard because it's a script. It's a little play that's playing out, and it's not about us. It's not about us per se. It's over us. It's like we are removed from the actual thing. And I think the role of independent media and alternative media is to actually deconstruct that media spiral, is actually to try to take those tropes that have become shorthand in the world and pull them apart, to try to make sense of them, and to try to create space for critical Muslim voices. That's actually a name of an organization, and I didn't mean it in that sense, but I mean like actual Muslims who have something to say, to be able to enter into the conversation and be able to speak. And I think the only way that that works is to not have representations of Muslims, but to have the full human diversity of Muslim subjectivity, of Muslim experiences, to be able to have a space so that we don't have because we do often have like a spokesperson from NCCM will get their required 2-minute rebuttal, and everybody be like, okay, that's great. Now getting back to the real news. So instead of that, I think we actually have to pull that media spiral apart and actually have room for actual Muslims to be in a conversation and to have a way of actually seeing Muslims as being real, complete, complex, diverse, differently opinionated humans. Okay, thanks. Thank you.